The Bride Who Never Forgave, Revenge Stories. It should have been a wedding remembered for its beauty, not its aftermath. Evelyn Costa Ramirez, 32, had spent a year planning it, the flowers imported from Lisbon, the dress sewn by hand in a small Paris atelier, the ceremony set against the Pacific, where the wind carried salt and promise in equal measure. The morning of the wedding, she was luminous, the kind of radiant that comes from certainty. But certainty, like love, is just a form of blindness dressed in lace. Because 2 hours before she was supposed to walk down the aisle, she saw the video. A single, unedited clip sent from an anonymous number, her fiancé, Jonathan Leclerc, kissing her maid of honor. It wasn't lust that gutted her, it was familiarity. The way his hands moved, the same rhythm, the same lie disguised as tenderness. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply whispered, "Fine. Let's keep the ceremony." No one noticed anything wrong. She smiled for photographs, laughed at toasts, looked like a woman in love. But every step she took was a calculation. Every vow rehearsed for irony. When the priest said, "Do you take this man?" she said, "Of course," and the guests applauded. Jonathan, trembling, believed she meant it. That night, during the reception, she pulled him aside. The air outside smelled like roses and whiskey. "I want to give you something," she said. He followed her to the suite upstairs, oblivious to the silence waiting there. The room was filled with mirrors, floor to ceiling, each one reflecting them from different angles. On the bed lay an envelope. He picked it up, confused, his name written in her looping script. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, his affair, documented with the precision of a surgeon. "You think this ruins me?" he said, pale. "No," she replied softly. "It completes me." He tried to apologize, of course. They always do. But she wasn't listening anymore. She walked to the center of the room, to where all the mirrors met, and pulled a small remote from her bouquet. One click, and hidden speakers came alive, his voice, whispering the same lines he'd once said to her, only now directed to someone else. The sound looped, echoing through the glass, until even his reflection began to look like a stranger. She didn't hit him. She didn't scream. She just made him watch, himself, multiplied infinitely. Every reflection a version of his betrayal. When it was over, she handed him a pen and the annulment papers she'd already prepared. "You can leave tonight," she said. "Or you can stay and hear it again." He signed. The next morning, she sent the video and photos to the press, not out of rage, but clarity. "People should know what love looks like when it tells the truth," she wrote. By afternoon, his company rescinded his position, his family disowned him, and his name became synonymous with ruin. Months later, she kept the mirrors, moved them into her new apartment. Visitors said it felt like walking into a cathedral made of reflection, beautiful and terrifying. When asked if she'd ever forgive him, she smiled faintly and said, "Forgiveness is for people who still care. I prefer remembering." On her nightstand sat the broken wedding ring, its diamond cracked in half. She never repaired it. Sometimes, she'd hold it up to the light, watching how the fractured stone refracted into a dozen small flames, each one burning quietly, like the bride who never forgave. By the second act, Evelyn Costa Ramirez had become famous for her composure. The tabloids loved her transformation, the abandoned bride who didn't collapse, didn't disappear, didn't forgive. Her photographs circulated online, always the same expression, serene, sharp, a little dangerous. "Grace under fire," one headline said. "Ice in silk," another. They didn't understand that forgiveness wasn't in her vocabulary. It was her replacement for faith. Her ex-husband, Jonathan Leclerc, tried to survive the scandal. He gave interviews, claimed it was a misunderstanding, said she'd weaponized heartbreak. The world didn't believe him. Evelyn didn't need to defend herself. Her silence became his punishment. Still, she wasn't done. Forgiveness would have been a surrender, but revenge could be a career. She founded the Mirror Foundation, a charity for women who deserved the truth before the ceremony. It sounded benevolent. It wasn't. It was vengeance disguised as public service. Her organization investigated infidelity, corporate misconduct, secret lives. Their anonymous dossiers destroyed engagements, bankrupted PR firms, dismantled reputations. Her name became synonymous with poetic justice. In interviews, she spoke softly, never admitting to anything directly. Forgiveness, she told one reporter, is a way of telling someone they still matter. I prefer to let people fade. But fading was never what Jonathan did. He began sending her letters, long, handwritten, increasingly desperate. He said he'd changed. He said he understood now. He asked to meet, to apologize. For months, she ignored him. Then, one night, curiosity won. She agreed to dinner in a public place. Just to see the ghost she'd created. He arrived looking smaller, his confidence drained, his eyes rehearsed for repentance. I don't expect you to forgive me, he began. I just need you to know I'm sorry. She studied him, almost kindly. You're not sorry, she said. You're nostalgic. There's a difference. He reached across the table. Evelyn, what do you want from me? She smiled faintly. Nothing. That's what makes it beautiful. He looked at her like a man realizing the afterlife existed and he wasn't invited. A week later, a scandal broke. Private recordings of Jonathan's new apology documentary leaked online, his tearful confessions, his rehearsed humility, all revealed to be scripted. The producer, it turned out, was an anonymous donor from the Mirror Foundation. Evelyn never commented. Her foundation's next campaign launched under a simple slogan: "We don't forgive. We expose." Donations tripled. At home, Evelyn still kept one mirror from her wedding suite, the only one that hadn't shattered. When Jonathan threw a glass that night, she'd hung it in her hallway, facing the front door. When she left each morning, she'd glance at her reflection, older now, calmer, unflinching, and whisper, "You were right not to forgive." Because forgiveness might have saved him. But it would have destroyed her. By the third year, Evelyn Costa Ramirez had turned her heartbreak into an empire. The Mirror Foundation now spanned 3 continents, a machine of curated exposure. Politicians, CEOs, influencers, anyone who preached virtue while rotting in secrecy, found themselves undone by Evelyn's invisible hand. She no longer needed to appear in public. Her myth did the work. The bride who never forgave had become a cultural archetype. A symbol of justice without softness. But in the quiet of her penthouse, Evelyn still heard the echo of her own cruelty. Forgiveness hadn't died, it had just gone underground. Whispering questions she refused to answer. Every night, she stood before the single mirror she'd kept from her wedding. The one that hadn't cracked. Her reflection was precise, immaculate, and increasingly foreign. She had built an empire of exposure but could not look herself in the eye for long. Then one morning, an envelope arrived at her office. No return address, no postmark. Inside was a photograph, her standing in that same mirror, taken from behind. Someone had been in her home. The message on the back read, Even saints need confession. She didn't tell her security team. She didn't call the police. Instead, she poured herself a drink and stared out over the city, wondering if revenge had finally sent something back. Weeks later, the first breach appeared. One of her anonymous investigators leaked files to the press, private emails, bank transfers, surveillance footage. Overnight, the hunter became the spectacle. The Mirror Bride exposed, the headlines read. They accused her of blackmail, emotional manipulation, even manufacturing evidence. Her empire cracked the way glass does, silently first, then all at once. She held a press conference. Cameras flashed. Her voice was calm, her eyes too clear. "You want a confession," she said. "Fine. I never forgave anyone. But forgiveness isn't noble. It's lazy. You think it saves you, it only delays the truth." Reporters shouted questions, but she walked off stage before they could finish. That night, she returned home and found every mirror in her apartment shattered, everyone except the original. On its surface, written in condensation as if by unseen hands, were the words, "You forgave him long ago. You just couldn't forgive yourself for it." She stared at the sentence until it faded. Then, for the first time in 3 years, she sat on the floor and cried, quietly. Without performance, without witnesses. In the morning, she donated the Mirror Foundation to a journalism collective and vanished from public life. Months later, a woman matching her description was seen working under another name at a rehabilitation center in Oaxaca, helping women rebuild after infidelity and loss. When a reporter eventually tracked her down, Evelyn refused an interview but sent a note. Forgiveness isn't peace. It's surrender. And sometimes surrender is the only revenge that lasts. No one ever saw her again. But her apartment remained untouched, preserved by the landlord. In the last surviving mirror, etched faintly at the corner, were 4 words carved by hand. The bride forgave nothing. By the 4th year, Evelyn Costa Ramirez had erased herself so completely that even her revenge began to feel like folklore. The Mirror Foundation still existed in name, but no one could say who ran it anymore. The offices had been moved offshore, the board members replaced. The original mission, "We don't forgive, we expose," now whispered like a warning rather than a slogan. People spoke of her in fragments, like she was an urban legend. Some said she'd gone into politics under another name. Others believed she was dead. But the truth was quieter, stranger, more deliberate. Evelyn had disappeared because she'd succeeded too well. In Oaxaca, the air smelled like clay and smoke. Evelyn lived in a small house by the hills, teaching women to make mosaics out of broken glass. She never mentioned her past. Her students called her Doña Eva, the kind of woman who knew how to look at your hands and see what they'd survived. She smiled often, but never at mirrors. There wasn't one in her home. The only reflective surface was the water in a stone basin outside, where sometimes, at dusk, she'd pause as if listening to something just beneath the surface. But the past, like light, finds its way through cracks. One morning, a journalist arrived, a young woman with a notepad and an expression of awe. "You're her," she said. "The bride who never forgave." Evelyn laughed softly. "You've mistaken me for a story," she replied. Still, the girl pressed on. "Do you regret it? Destroying him? Becoming what you became?" Evelyn thought about it for a long time. "Regret is just forgiveness in disguise," she said finally. "I don't regret, I remember." The interview was never published. Days later, the journalist's laptop was stolen, her notes erased, her audio corrupted. The file that remained contained only Evelyn's voice, distorted by wind. I didn't destroy him. I ended the part of me that needed him destroyed. Months passed. One evening, a storm hit the hills, hard and relentless. The next morning, villagers found pieces of colored glass scattered across the road near Evelyn's house, blue, gold, and crimson shards arranged in a perfect circle. Her students said she hadn't come to class. The house was empty, the basin dry. On the wall above it, someone had written in ash, "The mirror broke itself." Years later, collectors began finding unsigned art pieces made entirely of fractured mirrors, appearing in private galleries across Mexico City. Each mosaic depicted the same image, a woman in a wedding dress, faceless, standing before a sea of reflections. At the bottom corner of every piece, barely visible unless the light hit it just right, were 4 words carved by hand. The bride forgave nothing. By the 5th and final year, Evelyn Costa Ramirez had transcended from woman to parable. The bride who never forgave was no longer a name. It was a curse whispered in circles that traded on truth, betrayal, and spectacle. Her story had outgrown her, rewritten by journalists, poets, and self-help authors who couldn't decide if she was a monster, a martyr, or a prophet. Forgiveness had become a market, and she was its reluctant saint. But Evelyn was gone, dissolved into legend. Or perhaps into the reflection of anyone who had ever been wronged and decided to stay broken. On purpose. In a gallery in Los Angeles, her final work appeared without announcement. It wasn't signed, but everyone knew it was hers. The installation was simple, a wedding arch made of shattered mirrors, suspended by invisible wire. The room was silent except for a faint hum, feedback from hidden speakers, like a heart murmuring through glass. If you stood directly beneath the arch, the mirrors reflected only your face, multiplied endlessly, until you couldn't tell which one was real. On the floor, etched into marble, were the words, "Forgiveness was the vow I never took." Visitors reported strange things. Some claimed their reflections lagged, blinking a split second too late. Others said they heard a woman's laugh, faint and warm, just before the lights flickered. One critic fainted after whispering her own name aloud beneath the arch and hearing a voice, Evelyn's, whisper it back. The exhibit closed within a week, purchased anonymously for an undisclosed amount. The buyer's identity was never revealed, though rumors circled. A man with Jonathan Leclerc's eyes had been seen at the auction, standing alone, his reflection fractured across the mirrored glass. When the curator approached him to verify his name, he simply said, "I'm here to finish what she started." After that, sightings multiplied. A woman matching Evelyn's description was seen boarding a ferry to Catalina Island, her face half covered by a white scarf. Another report placed her in Lisbon, buying sea glass from a market stall, humming an old love song. But no one ever captured her image again, not once, not clearly. Some believed she had finally forgiven herself and vanished into anonymity. Others believed she had become something else entirely, a presence that lived in reflection, not flesh. Years later, when the Mirror Foundation was dismantled, its final message to donors appeared on its dormant website. Forgiveness is just a slower form of revenge. The message disappeared within the hour, but a fragment remained in cached archives, alongside a timestamp and one final signature, E. Costa Ramirez. And somewhere, in a quiet house facing the ocean, a single mirror still stands unbroken. When the light hits it at dusk, it reflects not the room behind it but the sea ahead. Endless and merciless. Locals say if you stand before it long enough, you can hear a soft voice behind your shoulder whisper, "He thought I never forgave." But forgiveness was never the point. Then the surface ripples, briefly, as if something on the other side exhales.